For this copper foil project, we are continuing on where we left off in the last video, where we actually applied the copper foil to the glass. If you haven't seen that one, I'll put a card up now just in case you wanted to check that one out. I have my good friend Carlos with me here to demonstrate some of the best practices to creating this copper foil stained glass art piece. Now we are on to the soldering step of this project. We started off by securing the perimeter with little wooden trim boards on 4 edges and nails on 2 of the remaining edges. This will help secure the glass in place before we start to tack everything together. This project we are using a Hakko solder iron with a built-in temperature control rheostat. This is my favorite copper foiling soldering iron because of the convenience of being able to change the temperature right on the handle. Alternatively, you can purchase a separate rheostat that will be able to essentially do the same thing with a standard soldering iron. The soldering iron stands have a spot to place a wet sponge that can be very useful to clean off the debris from the tip of the iron. As far as safety, we will be using a lead-based solder, so we'll want to use gloves, and it's of course always important to have good ventilation when doing these projects because when applying heat to the flexed areas, it will release fumes and you certainly do not want to be breathing that in. For ventilation, we have a fan that will blow away any fumes that we have, and a fume extractor that will suck those fumes up. For this project, we are using a paste flux, but there are alternatives like gel flux. Just be sure to use a flux that is meant for stained glass instead of other applications like plumbing fittings. We'll be fluxing our copper foil liberally. Overfluxing really just creates a bit more of a mess to clean up, but underfluxing will cause a bit of trouble with the copper foil and the solder sticking to it. You can of course always reapply as needed. In this panel, I did make a few mistakes that I would have liked to fix in hindsight, but we'll save all those comments for the end so you can find out what I would have done differently on this project. We are using a 60/40 solder, and the first step is to start tacking together all the joints. This will add a good bit of stability to the piece and help it to keep from pulling apart. After the tacking is done, we'll start to do more of a rough coat of solder along the foil, just trying to get the solder down and adding even more strength to this piece. It's important to remove the solder at the same time or slightly before removing the iron because you want to avoid the solder cooling and bonding to the glass and mistakenly lifting up the entire panel. If it does cool and bond to the panel, just heat it back up and it will release. This is one of the parts of the project I would have liked to do something a little different instead of what we did. In order to fill this bigger void between glass pieces, we have to slowly drip the solder. After some time, we'll be able to go over it after it has dried and cooled down. Probably I would have preferred to have recut this piece so that we don't have such a big void, but mistakes made now are learned for next time. If you have fluxed an area more than a few minutes ago, you may need to reapply. That will keep your project soldering smoothly. I try to flux about enough area that I can finish up within just a few minutes. Again, nothing you can't go back and reapply. It's useful to feed the solder into the iron, especially on longer runs of copper foil. Here Carlos is keeping the tip of the iron on the foil and feeding the solder from the backside. He can tell if it's starting to pull up too much, then he can either move a little bit faster, not feed as much solder in, or lift up the solder for a moment. If he sees that it needs more solder, he can move a bit slower or try pressing the solder into the iron tip a little bit more. So we are going to just keep moving right along until each piece of glass is attached to its neighbor. We're going to follow this up with decorative beadwork in a moment. Comment down below if you are a solder lover or a solder hater. It seems like most people have a bit of a major preference in that they quite enjoy or quite dislike soldering. Personally, I find it to be a pretty fun and rewarding step of the process. Once the first side is done, we'll go ahead and flip it. Now, remember last time we had to tack in the joints, but this time we can get right into soldering the foil runs since the other side is already fully connected. After another quick flux application, we're ready to start soldering again. You may notice some bubbles popping up. This is because there is air trap between the initial side and the flip side. Sometimes the flux can get in there, and when it's heated it will bubble up. So you'll want to be sure you're wearing some glasses for this step. This angle shows pretty well how I want to keep my vision unobstructed on where my iron is going while still being able to continuously feed the solder into the tip. I try to flux up enough area where I can knock it out in about 1 or 2 minutes before fluxing another area. It's a bit of a balancing act between not overfluxing where you'll have to reapply anyway, but also not disrupting your productivity when you're on what I call a soldering rampage. And here is what happens when you haven't fluxed a certain area and are trying to apply solder. It simply doesn't stick, but it's really no problem. Just reapply the flux and try soldering back over it. You'll see it smooths out nicely. You can see now the paper is flopping back and forth. That's because we have the fan going now to really push away any of those fumes far away before they have any chance of coming in contact with our faces. The fan is tilted mostly above the work surface area, so it doesn't cool down the iron too much where we can't work with it. If the fan was tilted more towards the table at a downward angle, it would cool the iron too much and would keep the solder from melting easily. Now that both sides have the initial soldering done, we can start doing the finished bead work. Carlos likes to do a quick clean to get rid of most of the old flux. You'll often find that solder can drip through the other side and may need to be redone. In this case, it didn't matter too much because we haven't done the decorative beadwork yet, but if we had already done it, you would just have to redo that spot. This is really a nice beginner method to grabbing some solder onto the iron and running it along the whole run of the copper foil. And you can even go back a few times if you feel like you need to touch up an area. And you'll see here he goes back and touches up a little spot that bubbles up. Every so often you can go back and touch up a spot right in the middle of the run if it's still in its molten state. But if it is in its solidified state, it might be a little bit harder to touch up a spot in the middle of the run. You might have to go ahead and reheat that entire run. Now, it is important too to keep in mind not to be reheating the same run over and over and over too frequently, because it can start to melt the adhesive underneath the foil and you'll start to see it burn off and it could end up failing. So you want to try to avoid overworking areas, maybe going over them a few times or at least letting them cool down before going back over them too often. Right here you can really see the light starting to reflect off of those iridescent glass in the wings, and this is one of the reasons why we did pick this glass out. So it's just something to note that if you want to do wings or you want to create this effect, kind of this rainbowish hue effect where there's multicolors inside of the piece of glass, when it's reflected off of it, check out the iridescent glass options. They come in a lot of different textures and a lot of different manufacturers make them. So there's a nice variety when it comes to these iridescent glasses. This up close angle, you can see the decorative bead versus the initial connecting work. It's a lot flatter when you're just kind of roughly initially connecting it, but the decorative bead has more of a rounded profile to it. Here we are going back and touching up a few areas, and when we do that, we like to start at a joint and end at a joint. It just seems to be a little bit of a cleaner look instead of ending right in the middle of a run, because there's normally at least some little textured edges there after you lift the iron up. Sometimes you'll kind of get lucky and get it to where it's pretty much perfectly smooth, almost like you did do it in a single run, but that is definitely the exception than it is the rule. So it's probably best, at least from what we've found, to start at the joint, run your iron along the copper foil in that run, and end at another joint, normally pulling off onto the glass. Pulling straight up can also cause a little bit of a textured finish on that soldered area. Carlos has another nice beginner tip where you can place little droplets of solder along the run so you don't have to worry about feeding the iron with the solder at the same time that you're running the bead. Carlos likes to clean as he goes, so we remove pretty much all the old flux on the first side before starting again on the other side. Now, I'll admit, it does look like I am going a little bit overboard with the flux here. I mean, I'm just really slapping it on. But you know, I do like to get into the groove of soldering. So when we get started, I like to keep going and make a lot of progress, be really productive, and really get on that soldering rampage like we talked about. But again, it might just end up kind of causing a little bit of a problem for myself when I have to go back and reapply. Now from here on, we are going through just like the first side, touching up all the areas that aren't looking well finished, starting from one joint and moving to the next. We'll keep this process until I'm pretty well satisfied with all the beadwork in the project. After that side is done, we are ready to start framing our window. In our case, we are doing a zinc border. Other options are lead or also to edge bead the panel. I personally prefer doing a lead or zinc border as it has a more consistent finish. To frame out this panel, we'll butt the pieces up against each other and make sure to miter the corners. Zinc especially is much stronger over the long term, as zinc is a rigid metal, but it is a little bit more difficult to bend. Fortunately, these are all straight edges on this panel, so we won't have to do any bending or curves, so zinc is a great candidate for this panel. To miter the corners, we are using a zinc miter saw. After making the cut, you'll have to deburr the edges. Here we use some lead dikes and a sandpaper, or you could use a file to smooth out that edge. If you don't have a miter saw, you can use a hacksaw, but it's quite a bit harder to get such a clean cut and to get the good angled cuts we're going to need. To get the correct angle, you will overlap both pieces in line with how they would meet up once adjoined to the panel. The illustration here shows how each piece overlays. You'll mark those 2 points, connect them, and cut along that line for a perfect joint every time. It may be wise to cut them slightly big because you can always trim them down but not necessarily add back to them. As you cut the pieces and make some progress on these, you can start to solder the ones that are fully complete. This will make it much easier to orient the new pieces instead of working with things that could still be shifting around a bit. Here we are simply cleaning up the zinc with some flux and fluxing the copper foil work, then soldering them both together. If the zinc is old and has oxidized, you may need to clean it up with some steel wool or sandpaper over the areas that you plan to solder. Now the brass pieces will solder, but we want to make it easier. So we clean it with a little bit of sandpaper very well to make it much easier for us to finish soldering this. So far this panel is coming out very nicely and we are coming up to some of the finishing touches here shortly. Before we get to soldering on these hooks, we have to finish up soldering the back side of the zinc. So we want to make sure that the zinc is soldered to the copper foil panel on both sides. Pretty much the same process, cleaning up the zinc, applying a little bit of flux, and soldering them at each intersection where the joints of the copper foil intersect with the perimeter zinc. This is going to really add a lot of strength, and make sure that your copper foil stained glass panel will be around for a very long time. Right here I am picking up the panel and inspecting the perimeter so I can tap down any burred edges that were left over from the zinc miter saw. After a quick soldering of the backside, we're ready to start attaching the hooks. We'll begin by picking up some solder with the iron and starting to tin the brass hook. It will help to have a clean iron so you're not getting any debris into your tinning job and forced to remove it afterwards. I'm sure to hold the hook with some pliers, heat up the brass hook, and then grab a bit of solder to tin it. Keep this item fluxed up so that your solder sticks easily. And remember, the iron is conducting a ton of heat to the brass hook. That's the whole reason why we've got the pliers holding on to it. And so go ahead and just learn from my mistakes. Try not to touch the things that are very hot. You'll be happy you did. Once we have the hooks tinned, we'll flux up the zinc and solder the hook to the zinc. You'll want to try to submerge the hook into the pool of solder. Once it looks to be evenly submerged, you can remove the iron but continue to hold the brass hook in place until the solder cools. Simply repeat this step to the other side, and that's it for the hooks. Now, next up, we will solder on a couple of antennas because, after all, bees do have those, I think, don't they? Anyways, mine will, so for this we will be using a tinned copper wire. This is essentially a copper wire that has received a coating that can be soldered further and patinaed. We'll twist it up with the lead dikes to give a nice gentle curve in the shape of the antennas that we want. Once we have the curved piece that we need, we'll cut it down to size. To attach these antennas, we will put a bit of flux onto the soldered foil, and once we have placed them in the correct location, we'll submerge the antenna into a drop of solder. Once the first one is on, we'll do the opposite side the same way. Once they're dry, we're done with that part. Now that we're done with the antennas, we're pretty much done soldering everything, and now we need to do a nice quick cleaning of the panel with some glass cleaner to get the surface of the glass and solder nice and clean. We also like to clean off the solder with some quadruple aught steel wool to remove any sort of oxidation that will prevent the patina from being applied properly. Today we're using the black patina, and there are some other colors like copper or green, but we're doing black today. The other option is to leave it plain silver, but we plan to do this in a black patina finish back when we used a black backing foil. Watch out for some of our other videos where we'll try out some other patinas. There are different formulas for different metals. The blue Novacan bottle is meant for solder, while the gray bottle is meant for zinc. So we'll be using these in combination for this piece. One way to apply the patina is to simply pour a bit onto a cloth and wipe the solder with it. It's important to be wearing gloves because patina is actually an acid having a reaction with the metals, so we want to protect ourselves as much as possible. This is really not my favorite way to apply patina, so I'm going to go run over and grab a quick tool. Now, I personally much prefer to use a flux brush applicator. Normally, I'll fill the cap of the patina with some patina and I'll do a generous coat of patina onto the solder. After it's applied, it will need a few minutes to have a nice reaction with the solder. The patina will not hurt the glass immediately, although you don't want to leave it on for an excessive amount of time because it can have a permanent reaction with the glass. Be sure to get all the little nooks and crannies where a bit of bare solder may still be exposed. Anything that was soldered will take the patina, including the antennas and the hooks. Now that we're here getting to the end of finishing up the first side, we're going to need to let that have the reaction with the metal. So we're going to pretty much leave it alone for about 5 to 8 minutes and then come back and start wiping off the excess. We set the fan on there, and now that the patina is starting to have a bit of a matte finish, we'll take a rag and start blotting the excess patina off. We're not quite polishing yet, just removing the excess. careful for any of the finishing touches like our delicate antennas. Now that we have removed the excess, we see it's a nice flat matte finish. Now we're starting to polish everything with a nice clean rag. We are trying to be sure to polish out any remaining contaminants including patina, flux, or anything else that may still be on the glass. This is going to really shine up the glass and give a professionally finished product. If your old rag is getting dirty, you're probably going to need to be switching it out because you'll be moving around contaminants instead of picking them up. After a few rounds of polishing, you can spray on a bit of glass cleaner. At this step, the reaction should have taken place and you'll be able to use a mild glass cleaner to continue removing any excess contaminants. You may need to hold it up to the light and look at an angle at the reflection on the glass to see the nice glossy finish and spot any areas that may need a little more attention. This side, we are cleaning up all the solder and zinc with steel wool to remove any oxidation or other contaminants that might have built up that will keep the patina from applying evenly. Now for this part, we are going to first do the perimeter to make sure that we have no surfaces left unpatinaed. The black patina is a good option, especially for beginners, because it helps to hide mistakes quite well. Silver and copper show any imperfections in the solder much more because the color of the solder will vary and show the different textures of the solder. If it's not a perfectly smooth bead, it'll be a little bit more noticeable. Another important consideration is that the zinc is already a silvery finish, so it works well with the unfinished silver solder. However, the copper patina will not be changing zinc much at all, so you'll want to do an edge bead instead of a zinc perimeter. We'll cover that in another video. Here we are especially starting to see the necessity of using the same backing color copper foil as the patina finish in the solder. We can see right through this piece to the backing, but it blends nicely since both finishes are the same. Any places where the foil is slightly uneven is better hidden now that the patina has been applied. Again, be sure to plan which backing color you plan to use for the finish you plan to use. It will very much stick out if they are not the same color. And now after we are done waiting a few minutes, we're ready to start blotting the excess again and wiping it down. You'll see me switching places on the rag as it becomes saturated in the area that's making contact to a fresh spot so we can continue picking up contaminants instead of simply smearing them around. This step definitely takes a little bit of elbow grease, but it's certainly worth it after it's done. It can be difficult to get all the contaminants out of the textured areas, and the best way that I've found to get into some of these areas is to use something like a toothbrush or some sort of brush with nylon bristles. Something that won't be too harsh like a steel wire brush, but something that will still be able to dig out any solids. I usually put the rag down onto the glass and brush it into the glass to get the best of both worlds. Your little toothbrush will get gummed up quickly and render it useless after a short while or force you to keep cleaning it. So that's my little workaround. There are a few things I would have done differently for this panel. The first is that I would have cut this orange piece a little bit bigger. We had a larger solder line that was uneven from the rest, and I would have preferred that to have been filled with glass instead of solder. Now, I also would have preferred to modify the design so we don't have these tiny little pieces on the perimeter. Kind of a minor thing, but it just would have maybe resized the design slightly. We could have avoided that. Other than that, we are both pleased with the final product. So that's pretty much it for this instructional series. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. Comment below what you think we should make next, and subscribe if you would like to see more awesome stained glass projects. Thanks for watching!